These are some of the strangest and most unsettling stories I've ever come across. This happened a long time ago, back when I was living in the first apartment I'd ever rented on my own. I was in my early 20s, still trying to figure out what being an adult was supposed to look like. My days were spent working a fairly ordinary job, and my nights were usually wasted scrolling through the internet far later than I should have been. Looking back now, I realize how careless I was about online privacy and security. At the time, though, it never crossed my mind. The internet felt different back then, smaller somehow. Maybe it wasn't actually smaller, but it felt familiar. You visited the same forums every day, saw the same usernames over and over, and gradually developed the assumption that most people online were harmless. One of the sites I visited regularly was connected to the area where I lived. I won't name it, and I won't even say what region it covered. Even now, I'd rather keep those details to myself. The site was simple. People posted local updates, neighborhood questions, event announcements, traffic issues. Basically the kind of things you'd find today in a local Facebook group. I wasn't an active contributor most of the time. I mostly lurked, scrolling out of boredom and curiosity. Around that particular time, there was a huge amount of discussion about a sports team. I'll keep that vague as well. The team had been making headlines for several days, and it seemed like every other post was either a news article, a rumor, or somebody arguing about what was happening. Even people who normally didn't care about sports were talking about it. One night after work, sometime around midnight, I was lying on my bed with my laptop balanced on my stomach. The apartment was quiet, except for the television playing softly in the background. I wasn't really watching it. It was just there to fill the silence. I remember feeling tired, but not tired enough to sleep. I was scrolling through the site when a notification appeared. Someone had sent me a private message. That wasn't unusual. People occasionally messaged each other about local topics or conversations happening on the page. The username wasn't familiar, but that didn't raise any alarms. It looked completely normal. Nothing about it stood out. The message itself was short, and it said something along the lines of, "Hey, here's the latest update about the team." Underneath was a link. That was it. Because the topic had been everywhere that week, I didn't think twice about it. My immediate assumption was that whoever sent it had seen one of my comments earlier and figured I'd be interested. Without really considering it, I clicked. The page that opened wasn't what I expected. In fact, for the first few seconds, I thought it had failed to load. The entire screen was black. Not a website with missing images, not a partially loaded page, just black. And right in the center was a single red dot, a small red circle. Nothing else, no text, no logos, no advertisements, no loading icon, just a red dot floating in the middle of a black screen. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The longer I looked at it, the stranger it felt. It wasn't doing anything, but it somehow managed to make me uncomfortable anyway. At first, I told myself I was being ridiculous. Websites break all the time. Pages fail to load. There had to be a simple explanation. Still, I remember hesitating before closing the tab. Something about it felt deliberate, as if the page wasn't unfinished at all, as if what I was looking at was exactly what someone intended me to see. Sometimes links would break or images wouldn't load properly back then, so at first I wasn't overly concerned. I refreshed the page. The same thing appeared, a black screen, a single red dot in the center. Nothing else. For some reason, The emptiness of it bothered me more than if there had been something obviously disturbing on the screen. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't graphic. It was just wrong. The longer I looked at it, the more I had the strange feeling that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. Of course, I told myself I was being ridiculous. Websites malfunction all the time. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness. After a minute or so, I closed the tab and went back to the message. I sent the person a reply, keeping it casual. "Hey, the link you sent just shows a black page with a red dot." A couple of minutes later, they responded. They claimed the news article must have been removed. The explanation sounded reasonable at first, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. Even if an article gets taken down, you usually see something: a missing page notice, an error message, a blank template from the site. You don't normally end up staring at a completely black page with a single red dot in the middle. I sent another message asking what website the article had supposedly been on. This time, there was no response. I waited for a while, checked back a few times, and eventually gave up. At that point, I convinced myself it was just some strange internet glitch. Odd, sure, but hardly worth losing sleep over. Within a day or two, I'd mostly forgotten about it. Then 3 or 4 days later, another message appeared. Same account. The moment I saw the username, I immediately remembered the link. This message didn't contain any text, just an image attachment. Without thinking much about it, I clicked. Even now, years later, I can still picture that image almost perfectly. The photo appeared to show a room. It looked unfinished, almost like a basement. Bare concrete walls, dim lighting, very little furniture. The image had that cold, empty feeling that some places have when they don't seem meant for people to spend time in. There was someone lying on the floor. Another person stood nearby. The standing figure wore some kind of mask that covered most of their face. The only visible part was the mouth. It appeared to be smiling. I'm not going to describe the image beyond that. Partly because it was disturbing, and partly because I still don't like revisiting it in detail. For the purposes of this story, it's enough to say that what was depicted was clearly not normal. The image carried an immediate sense that something was deeply wrong. I remember staring at it, trying to figure out what exactly I was looking at. My first instinct was that it had to be fake. Back then, manipulated images certainly existed, but they weren't nearly as convincing as they can be today. Most edited photos had obvious flaws if you looked closely enough. This one didn't. At least, not that I could see. That didn't mean it was real, of course. It could have been staged. It could have been some kind of shock image created specifically to disturb people. The internet was full of people trying to get reactions. But the more I looked at it, the less confident I became. I couldn't decide whether it was fake or real, and somehow that uncertainty made it worse. I messaged the sender again. "What is this supposed to be?" No response. Hours passed. Nothing. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a harmless prank. Up until then, I'd assumed I was dealing with some random person sending weird links for entertainment. Annoying, maybe. Creepy, maybe. But ultimately, meaningless. The photograph changed that. There was an intention behind it. A feeling. It wasn't trying to be funny. It wasn't trying to start a conversation. It felt like it had been sent for the sole purpose of making whoever received it uncomfortable. And what bothered me most was the growing suspicion that the sender knew exactly what effect it would have. I ended up showing the image to a couple of friends, partly because I wanted a second opinion, and partly because I wanted someone else to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, their reactions only made me feel more uneasy. Their reactions were immediate. The moment they saw the image, both of them told me the same thing. Report it. One of them even suggested I go directly to the police. At the time, though, that felt like an overreaction. I kept searching for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a still frame from some low-budget horror film. Maybe it was part of an art project. Maybe some random person online was trying to shock strangers for entertainment. The truth is, part of me simply didn't want to involve law enforcement over something that might turn out to be meaningless. So instead of reporting it, I blocked the account. Once I did that, I felt relieved. At least for a while. I told myself it was over, and for about a week, it seemed like I was right. Then one night, everything changed. I had already gone to bed, but I wasn't asleep yet. I was lying there scrolling through my phone in the dark. The television was off. The apartment was quiet. My bedroom door was open. At some point, I happened to glance toward the hallway, and I saw someone standing there. Even now, that's the part that stays with me. Not because I immediately panicked, because I didn't. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to understand what I was looking at. People always imagine fear as an instant reaction, but sometimes confusion comes first. I just stared. The figure stood motionless in the hallway, facing my room, watching. My first ridiculous thought was that maybe one of my friends had come over somehow and I hadn't heard them enter. That explanation made absolutely no sense. I lived alone. But the mind will grab onto any explanation it can find before accepting something frightening. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out the shape more clearly. It was definitely a person. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking, just standing there, looking into my room. A cold feeling started spreading through my chest. Then the figure slowly raised their right hand. They were holding something, an object about the size of a small box, maybe smaller. I couldn't tell. The hallway was too dark. Before I could focus on it, a smell suddenly filled the room. Not an ordinary bad smell, not garbage, not spoiled food. Something rotten, something heavy. The kind of smell that instantly triggers a reaction deep in your brain. A smell that makes every instinct tell you that something is wrong. Seriously wrong. I felt a surge of fear so intense, it almost seemed to bypass thought completely. 1 second I was staring, the next I was shouting. "Who's there?" The figure reacted immediately. They stepped backward, not quickly, not running. Just one smooth movement into the darkness. And then they were gone. I jumped out of bed and ran to the doorway. The hallway was empty, completely empty. My heart was pounding so hard that I could actually feel it vibrating through my chest and neck. I remember standing there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd fallen half asleep. Maybe I'd mistaken a shadow for a person. But then the smell hit me again. Still there, still lingering in the hallway. And that was what convinced me I'd seen something real. I ran straight to the front door and locked it. Even though I wasn't entirely sure whether whoever I'd seen had come from outside or had somehow already been inside. Then I called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the apartment thoroughly. Every room, every closet, every corner. Nobody was there. I showed them the messages. I showed them the image. I explained everything from the beginning. Unfortunately, By the time they attempted to trace the account, it had vanished. Not blocked, not inactive. Gone. The profile no longer existed. The original link with the black screen and red dot no longer worked either. It was as though the entire thing had been erased. The image wasn't much help. The person in the photograph wore a mask that concealed most of their face, and the room itself contained almost nothing identifiable. The officers asked the obvious questions. Did I have enemies? Had I argued with anyone recently? Was there anyone who might have wanted to scare me? I told them no. And as far as I knew, that was the truth. I had never spoken to that account before receiving the first message. At least not knowingly. To this day, I don't know whether the figure in my hallway was connected to those messages. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I've spent years going back and forth on that question. But what keeps bothering me isn't the image. And it isn't the red dot. It's the smell. That horrible, rotten smell. The way it flooded the hallway the exact moment the figure raised their hand. I've never figured out what caused it. I've never encountered anything quite like it since. And every time I think back on that night, I find myself wondering the same thing. Did the sender expect me to see them again? Was the appearance in my hallway intentional? Did they know I would recognize the connection? And what exactly were they holding when they raised their hand toward me? I still don't have answers. Maybe I never will. What I do know is that experience permanently changed the way I think about the internet. Before that, online interactions felt distant, abstract, separated from real life. Afterward, I realized how thin that separation really is. Sometimes all it takes is a single message from the wrong person for those two worlds to collide, and that realization is far more unsettling than any image I was ever sent. This happened about 8 years ago when I was living in an apartment complex in Ohio. At the time, my life was pretty quiet. I wasn't the type of person who went out much. Most evenings were spent at home watching movies, scrolling through my phone, or texting my best friend Katie, who lived about 50 minutes away. We usually only saw each other on weekends. So during the week, our conversations happened almost entirely through text messages. The apartment complex itself wasn't creepy. That's something I always feel the need to mention. Whenever people hear stories like this, they imagine some rundown building with flickering lights and dark hallways. This place wasn't like that. It was one of those apartment complexes built sometime in the late 70s where every unit looked exactly the same. Same floor plan, same doors, same narrow hallways. Mine was on the first floor facing the parking lot, which I actually preferred because I hated carrying groceries upstairs after work. The people there seemed normal. Families, college students, young professionals. Across the hall lived a paramedic named Dan, who worked night shifts. We'd occasionally pass each other in the mornings, him coming home exhausted while I was heading out for work. The only thing I really remember about the building itself was how thin the walls were. You could hear almost everything. Footsteps from upstairs, cabinets closing, water running through pipes. Sometimes the plumbing would make strange knocking sounds whenever someone took a shower. After living there long enough, you started recognizing people without ever seeing them. You learned their schedules through noise alone. You knew when someone got home, when they cooked dinner, when they left for work. It became background information your brain absorbed without realizing it. I'd lived there for about a year before anything unusual happened. The night it started was completely ordinary. I'd fallen asleep on the couch while watching Netflix. That wasn't unusual for me. In fact, it happened often enough that I usually woke up sometime after midnight and dragged myself to bed. At some point during the night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. The apartment was dark. Completely dark except for the faint blue glow of the cable box clock across the room. Still half asleep, I stood up and walked toward the hallway. That's when I noticed something felt off. Not frightening, just wrong. One of those tiny details your brain notices before you consciously understand it. I stopped for a moment, listened. There was water running. At first, I assumed it was coming from another apartment. That happened all the time. But as I walked farther down the hallway, the sound grew louder and closer. By the time I reached the bathroom door, I was certain the water was coming from inside my own bathroom. It sounded exactly like the sink faucet had been turned on full blast. I stood there for a second trying to make sense of it. I lived alone, and I was almost positive I hadn't used the sink before falling asleep. I had brushed my teeth earlier that evening, hours before, but that was it. Then I noticed something else. The bathroom door was closed. That immediately bothered me. Not because it was scary, because it was unusual. I almost never closed the bathroom door when I was by myself. It simply wasn't a habit I had. For a moment I wondered if I'd done it absent-mindedly and forgotten. People forget things all the time, especially late at night. That explanation felt reasonable enough, at least until I tried the handle. It didn't move. The door was locked. I stared at it, then tried again. Still locked. The bathroom had one of those simple push-button privacy locks built into the knob. Nothing complicated? You push the button from inside, close the door, and it stays locked until someone turns the handle. The problem was obvious. There shouldn't have been anyone inside. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Not panic, confusion. I started mentally replaying the evening. Had I somehow locked it earlier? Had the lock engaged accidentally when the door shut? Was there some mechanical issue with the handle? I kept searching for explanations because none of the alternatives felt particularly appealing. Meanwhile, the water continued running. Steady, uninterrupted, almost loud now in the quiet apartment. I actually knocked on the door, which sounds ridiculous when I say it now. I knew I lived alone. I knew nobody should have been in there. Yet some part of me still expected an answer. Maybe because the situation already felt irrational. Maybe because knocking somehow felt easier than immediately opening the door. No response came. Just the sound of running water. I walked back to my bedroom and grabbed a small screwdriver from the junk drawer in my nightstand. Those privacy locks are usually easy to bypass. The words didn't fully make sense. That somehow made them worse. Then I heard the click of a lighter. A small metallic flick, followed by silence. Then another click, and another. Each one made my stomach tighten. I found myself holding my breath every time it happened, waiting for something I was terrified would come next. But nothing did. The clicks kept coming. Again. 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 Then frustrated breathing. The smell of gasoline remained thick in the air, stronger than ever. Eventually, the muttering grew louder, angrier. One sentence cut through clearly enough for me to understand. Why isn't it working? Then more words I couldn't make out. The sound of pacing followed. Then suddenly, nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural after so much noise. I stood frozen in the bathroom, listening, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. Several seconds passed, maybe longer. Time felt distorted. Then his voice came through the door one last time. Calmer now, almost conversational, but still directed more toward himself than toward me. I'll come back. The words sent a chill through me. Not because he shouted them, because he didn't. He sounded certain, like he fully expected there would be another opportunity. A moment later, I heard footsteps moving away through the apartment, toward the front door, then the sound of the door opening, closing, and finally, silence. Real silence. The only thing left was the sound of my own breathing and my heart pounding so hard that it felt louder than anything else in the apartment. I remember standing there for several seconds, unable to move, partly because I was terrified he might still be there, and partly because I couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had before I fell asleep on the couch. Yet somehow, in the span of a few minutes, it no longer felt like a place I knew. The moment I realized he was gone, I started screaming again. Not the controlled yelling I'd been doing before. Real panic. The kind where you're no longer thinking about what you're saying. You're just making as much noise as possible and hoping someone hears you. I pounded on the door over and over until my hands hurt. Shouting, kicking, anything. Time felt strange in that bathroom. Part of me thought only a minute or two had passed. Another part felt like I'd been trapped in there forever. Then I heard something. A loud banging sound from the front of the apartment. For a split second, my stomach dropped. I thought he had come back. Then a voice called out, a man's voice, asking if everything was okay. I've never been so relieved to hear another human being in my life. It was one of my neighbors, a guy named Billy. He was getting ready for an early shift and had heard me screaming through the wall. I started yelling back immediately, telling him I was trapped in the bathroom. A few moments later, I heard movement in the apartment. Then footsteps coming down the hallway. The bathroom door rattled, and finally it opened. The second I saw another person standing there, the adrenaline that had been holding me together seemed to crash all at once. Billy pulled the door open and just stared for a second. The smell hit him immediately. Gasoline. It was everywhere, not just in the hallway. The entire apartment seemed saturated with it. I stumbled out of the bathroom and into the living room while trying to explain what had happened. My breathing was so shaky that I could barely get a full sentence out. I remember feeling frustrated because nothing I said sounded coherent. Everything had happened so quickly that my thoughts were still scattered. Billy listened for only a few seconds before telling me we needed to get outside. Immediately. The fumes were strong enough that even he looked concerned. We stepped out of the apartment and waited for police to arrive. The rest of the night felt surreal. Officers searched the apartment, then the surrounding building, then the parking lot and nearby areas. Whoever had been inside was gone. Completely gone. One of the officers eventually showed me what they found. Near the kitchen entrance sat a small plastic gasoline container, the kind someone might keep in a garage or storage shed. The lighter was still there too, just left behind, as if whoever had brought them had suddenly abandoned whatever they were trying to do. That detail bothered me almost as much as the attack itself, because it suggested something had interrupted him. Something had gone wrong. And if it hadn't, I try not to think about that part. The police processed the apartment thoroughly. They dusted for fingerprints, photographed everything, interviewed neighbors. Several people had heard the commotion. Some had heard me screaming. but nobody reported seeing anyone leave the building. Nobody. That made the whole thing feel even stranger. There was no sign of forced entry either. No broken lock, no damaged window, nothing. It was as if the man had simply appeared inside my apartment and then disappeared again. Of course, logically, I know that isn't what happened. There had to be a way in. There had to be a way out. But for a long time, that unanswered question kept replaying in my head. The weeks afterward were almost as unsettling as the incident itself. Detectives contacted me several times. Each conversation felt nearly identical. Did I have enemies? Had I argued with anyone recently? Was there an ex-boyfriend? A stalker? Someone obsessed with me? Every time I gave the same answer, no. My life was incredibly ordinary, almost boring. I worked, I came home, I talked to friends. That was about it. There wasn't anyone who made sense. No obvious suspect. No person I could point to and say, maybe it was them. But there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. The voice. Even now, after all these years, that's the part that stays with me more than the mask, more than the gasoline, more than being trapped behind that door. While he was pacing outside the bathroom, talking to himself, something about his voice felt familiar. Not familiar enough to identify, just familiar enough to bother me. The feeling was strange, like hearing a song you've known your entire life playing faintly in another room. You recognize it instantly. You know you've heard it before. But no matter how hard you try, you can't remember the title, or where you heard it, or why it matters. That's what his voice felt like. For years afterward, I would occasionally hear someone speaking in public and feel a sudden jolt of recognition before realizing it wasn't the same person. My brain kept trying to solve a puzzle it didn't have enough pieces to solve. Sometimes I wondered if the familiarity was entirely in my head. Maybe trauma had created that feeling afterward. Maybe my mind was desperately trying to connect the event to someone I knew because the alternative, that a complete stranger had chosen me at random, felt harder to accept. But I don't know. I honestly don't. What I do know is that the man was never caught. No arrest, no explanation, nothing. Whoever he was, he knew enough about my apartment to get inside quietly while I slept only a few feet away on the couch. He knew enough to lock me inside the bathroom. And somehow, for reasons I've never understood, his voice felt connected to a part of my life that I couldn't quite reach. That's the detail that never settled. Not the attack, not the investigation, not even the fact that he escaped. It's that lingering feeling of recognition. The sense that if I could just remember one missing detail, everything would suddenly make sense. 8 years later, it still hasn't. And sometimes that's more unsettling than having no answer at all. This happened about 7 years ago. At the time, I was working a temporary job for a small agricultural company. The pay was decent, and the work had me moving from one rural area to another for months at a time. Whenever they sent someone out to a job site, the company usually arranged a cheap rental house nearby. The place where this happened was somewhere in central Missouri. I honestly couldn't tell you the exact town anymore. It was one of those tiny rural communities where the population sign might say 800 people. But somehow, the houses are still spread miles apart. Blink while driving through and you'd probably miss the entire town. My job involved maintaining irrigation systems on several farms outside the area. Most days were spent repairing pumps, checking equipment, and driving long stretches of country roads. The rental house they gave me sat about 15 minutes from the nearest gas station. It was a small, aging house tucked off a dirt road, surrounded by fields and clusters of trees. The landscape was exactly what you'd expect from that part of the Midwest. Open farmland broken up by patches of woods that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness at night. The isolation didn't bother me. If anything, I liked it. After spending all day working around noisy machinery, the quiet was almost comforting. The only thing that stood out about the property was the house next door. When I say next door, I don't mean right beside mine. There was probably 50 or 60 yards between the two houses, with a thin strip of trees separating them. Even so, I could see it clearly from my kitchen window. It was an old 2-story place. Weathered paint, dark windows. The kind of house that looked like it had slowly been forgotten. When I first moved in, I asked the property manager about it. He told me it had been vacant for years. According to him, the owner had moved away a long time ago, and nobody had bothered restoring or renting the property since. That explanation seemed perfectly reasonable. Rural areas are full of abandoned homes, so I didn't think much about it. For the first couple of months, life settled into a predictable routine. I'd get up before sunrise, drive out to whichever farm needed work, spend the day dealing with irrigation equipment, and return home sometime in the evening. Most nights I'd make dinner, watch television, or call my girlfriend back home before going to bed. It was a simple existence. Quiet, almost boring. And honestly, I liked it that way. Out there, nighttime felt different from what most people are used to. There were very few lights. No nearby traffic, no city glow on the horizon. When darkness arrived, it arrived completely. Because of that, even the smallest light stood out. About 2 months after moving in, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes sometime around 10 or 11 at night. I happened to glance out the window, and that's when I noticed it. A light was on in the upstairs window of the neighboring house. At first, I barely reacted. My immediate assumption was that someone had finally moved in. Maybe the owner had returned. Maybe the place had been sold. There were plenty of normal explanations. Still, something felt a little odd. The house had looked completely abandoned every single day since I'd arrived. I had never seen a vehicle parked outside, never seen movement, never seen anyone working on the property. Yet there it was, a light glowing from one of the upstairs rooms. I watched it for a few seconds before returning to what I was doing. By the next morning, I'd mostly forgotten about it. But then I noticed it again, a few nights later, then again after that. Sometimes the light appeared upstairs. Other times it seemed to come from a room downstairs. The pattern felt random. What slowly began to bother me wasn't the lights themselves. It was everything else. I never saw anybody. Not once. No vehicles, no visitors, no signs of renovation, nothing. Now, to be fair, I wasn't conducting surveillance on the place. I spent most of my day at work. It's entirely possible someone was coming and going while I was gone. That's what I kept telling myself. But the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore. Every night I'd glance over there almost automatically. And every night I'd find myself wondering the same thing. Who was turning those lights on? Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One evening after work, with the sun starting to dip behind the trees, I decided to walk over and see if anyone was actually living there. I figured I'd go introduce myself. After all, If someone had actually moved into the neighboring house, we were essentially the only two people living in that immediate area. The closer I got to the property, the stranger it looked. From my kitchen window, it had seemed merely neglected. Up close, it looked abandoned. The porch boards were gray from years of weather exposure, some of them slightly warped. Dirt streaked the windows. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips. The gravel driveway was littered with weeds that had grown up through the stones, as if nobody had driven over them in years. There wasn't a single vehicle anywhere on the property. No signs of recent activity. No indication that anyone actually lived there. I walked onto the porch and knocked. Nothing. I waited for a moment and knocked again. Still nothing. The silence felt unusually heavy. Eventually, I tried the door handle. Locked. No movement at all. At that point, I assumed I'd simply come at a bad time. Maybe whoever I'd seen through the lights had gone out earlier. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe there was some perfectly ordinary explanation I hadn't considered. Feeling slightly embarrassed, I headed back toward my own house. I was almost there when I heard it. A voice. At least, I think it was a voice. It sounded like a woman speaking from somewhere inside the neighboring house. Not loud, not clear, just a faint murmur drifting through the evening air. The kind of sound where your brain immediately recognizes human speech, but you can't distinguish a single word. I stopped walking, turned around. The house stood completely dark. No lights, no movement, nothing. I stood there listening for another minute. The sound didn't come again. Looking back, that was probably the first moment I felt genuinely uneasy. Not frightened, just unsettled. Like there was something I wasn't understanding. Eventually, I went inside and convinced myself I was overthinking it. For a few days, life returned to normal. Then one evening, around 9 o'clock, I heard a scream. The sound hit me so suddenly that I sat upright before I even realized what I'd heard. It sounded like a woman. The noise had clearly come from the direction of the neighboring house. I muted my laptop immediately and listened. Silence. Just crickets. Wind moving through the trees. Nothing else. For several seconds, I sat there wondering whether I'd imagined it. Then I got up and walked to the kitchen window. The neighboring house was dark, exactly as it always was. No lights, no movement, no indication that anyone was there. For the first time since moving in, I felt genuinely uncomfortable. This wasn't a neighborhood where strange sounds could easily be dismissed. There weren't dozens of nearby homes. There weren't busy streets. There were only 2 houses out there. Mine. And that one. Eventually, I decided to call the local police. Honestly, I felt a little foolish doing it. When someone answers the phone and asks what's wrong, I heard a scream coming from an abandoned house. Doesn't exactly sound convincing. But to my surprise, they took it seriously. A couple of deputies arrived not long afterward. I met them outside and pointed toward the property. They walked over and checked the area while I watched from my yard. One of them knocked repeatedly on the front door. No answer. The same thing that had happened to me. They checked around the sides of the house, looked through windows, tried the back door. Everything appeared secured. No signs of forced entry, no broken glass, nothing. Eventually, one of the deputies came back and explained that without clear evidence someone was inside or in danger, they couldn't legally force their way into the house. He suggested that maybe someone had been on the property earlier and left before they arrived. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, but it was the only one available. Before leaving, They told me to call again if anything else happened. For a while, nothing did. Then, about 3 weeks later, I started hearing something entirely different. It happened late at night. A strange mechanical sound. The first time I heard it, I thought it might be farm equipment somewhere in the distance. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that it was coming from the neighboring house. The sound reminded me of a drill, or some kind of motor. A steady mechanical whirring. I actually went outside and stood in the yard trying to pinpoint the source. There was no mistake. It was coming from that property. The noise continued for maybe 15 minutes before abruptly stopping. Then everything became quiet again. A few days later, it happened again. Then again. Always at night. Always coming from the same place. That was when the situation stopped feeling merely strange. It started feeling wrong. Because no matter how many times I replayed the facts in my head, they didn't fit together. The house was supposedly abandoned. The doors were locked. The police had checked it. Yet lights appeared inside. Voices came from within. A woman had screamed. And now machinery seemed to be operating somewhere in the building after dark. None of it made sense. The explanations I kept giving myself were starting to fall apart. A few days later, I was walking along the back edge of my property, checking part of the fence line. I wasn't thinking about the house at the time. At least not until I noticed something that made me stop walking altogether. From that angle, I could see behind the neighboring house. There was a small clearing back there that wasn't visible from my kitchen window. Near the edge of the yard sat a few plastic storage containers, the kind people use for tools or seasonal items. At first, nothing about them seemed unusual. Then I noticed something draped over one of them. Clothing, women's clothing from the look of it. A couple of garments hung partially over the side of the container, moving slightly in the breeze. I probably would have ignored them, if not for the stains. Even from a distance, I could see dark patches on the fabric. Something about the color immediately made my stomach tighten. My mind recognized it before I wanted to admit it. It looked like blood. I remember standing completely still, staring. At the same time, I was desperately trying to come up with another explanation. Rust, paint, mud, anything. The human brain is surprisingly good at finding innocent explanations when it doesn't want to accept what it's seeing. Then a man stepped out from behind the house. The sudden movement startled me enough that I almost took a step backward. He walked directly toward the container. No hesitation, no sign that he'd just noticed it. As if he already knew exactly what was there. He bent down, picked it up effortlessly, and carried it back toward the house. The whole time, he never once looked in my direction. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it somehow made me more nervous. Because I couldn't shake the feeling that he already knew I was there, that he didn't need to look. A few seconds later, he disappeared inside. I immediately turned around and headed back toward my house, trying not to run, trying to stay calm, trying to convince myself that I wasn't jumping to conclusions. By the time I reached my back door, my hands were trembling enough that I fumbled with the key. I kept replaying what I'd seen. Maybe the stains weren't blood. Maybe the clothes belonged to someone living there. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But every explanation ran into the same problem. If somebody had been living there all along, why had the place appeared abandoned? Why had the deputies found every entrance secured? Why did nobody ever seem to come or go? Standing in my kitchen, I found myself staring out the window at the neighboring house while trying to decide what to do. Then someone knocked on my back door. The sound was so sudden that I physically jumped. For a split second, pure panic took over. I turned toward the door. Through the glass panel, I could see a person standing outside. It was him, the same man, the one I'd just watched behind the neighboring house. He was standing there, looking directly at me, not waving, not smiling, not trying to introduce himself, just staring. I remember a strange feeling settling over me at that moment. Not just fear, exposure, the realization that whatever distance I thought existed between us no longer existed at all. He knew where I lived. He knew I was home. And somehow it felt like he knew I'd been watching. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. For several seconds, we simply looked at each other through the glass. Then he knocked once more. A single, deliberate knock, and turned away. Without a word, he walked toward the trees. The whole thing felt wrong, not threatening in an obvious way, almost worse than that. It felt intentional, like he understood exactly how unsettling the encounter was and had chosen to leave things unanswered. That was the moment I stopped second-guessing myself. I picked up the phone and called the police again. When the deputies arrived, I told them everything. The clothing, the stains, the man behind the house, the knock at my door. This time, they seemed far more concerned. A group of officers crossed the property with flashlights and eventually forced entry into the house. I watched from my yard as they disappeared inside. The wait felt much longer than it probably was. Every minute seemed to stretch. Part of me expected them to emerge with some simple explanation that would make me feel foolish. Another part of me wasn't sure what I expected. When they finally came back outside, their expressions immediately caught my attention. One of the deputies told me they hadn't found anyone inside. No man, no residents, nobody at all. But something about the house clearly wasn't right. According to him, one room contained only a mattress lying on the floor. The entire area smelled strongly of cleaning chemicals, not the normal smell of an abandoned building. Fresh chemicals, strong enough that the officers noticed it immediately. The floor in that room appeared to have been heavily scrubbed. Beyond that, the house was mostly empty. No obvious explanation, no clear evidence of who had been there, and no sign whatsoever of the man I had seen only a short time earlier. The deputies searched the surrounding property but came up empty. No vehicles, no footprints they could use. Nothing. Just more unanswered questions. About 2 weeks later, my assignment in the area ended. I packed my belongings, left the rental house, and moved on to the next job. I never went back. As far as I know, nothing ever came from the investigation. Nobody ever contacted me with answers. I never learned who the man was. I never learned whether someone had actually been living in that house. And I never found out why the place seemed occupied one day and abandoned the next. What bothers me most isn't any single thing I saw. It's how all the pieces fit together. The lights, the voice, the scream, the machinery running late at night, the stained clothing, the man appearing behind the house, then appearing at my door only minutes later. Individually, each event has a possible explanation. Together, they form something I still can't make sense of. Even now, 10 years later, I occasionally find myself thinking about that house and wondering what was really happening inside it when everyone believed it was empty.